Lanete, bonjour, and good day to everyone, participants. First, Marcicho, thank you, Elder Mike Mitchell, for the most wonderful prayer. So appreciative and very touching. I also want to thank FNEAA for the invite to present to our national audience today. I'm very honored, and I want to extend a major thanks, Marcicho, to especially to Simon Bird, who approached me on this. And I also want to extend a special thank you to Darren Guillet. Darren was very influential for us prior to our establishment, but we did have an opportunity to visit Darren and the MK in Halifax and Nova Scotia, and it was the most wonderful trip and so welcoming. I have to say a special Marcicho Darren, and to all the people of the MK on how they welcomed us from Saskatchewan. I'd like to certainly share with the audience and then participants our venture, our trip, I guess our challenges in terms of establishing an education authority. I'll put it into perspective for you. As you know, this authority, the Athabasca Denesuline Education Authority, is in Saskatchewan. We're really proud to say that we are the first amalgamated education authority to be developed in Saskatchewan. And when I look across the nation, we are the second across the nation to put together an amalgamated education authority. The location of our bands, we have 3 Denesuline bands that are members of our authority. And they are in isolated points in the extreme north of Saskatchewan. I would say the location would be Fond du Lac is on Lake Athabasca, approximately 60 kilometers from the Northwest Territories border. We have Black Lake First Nation, again, near the Black Lake. And further on the east side, we have Hatchet Lake First Nation on the immense Wollaston Lake. And these 3 communities comprise the ADEA, which I refer to. When we look at the location and the size of our communities, they are approximately 1,200 to 1,800 in population within each of our communities. 2, Fond du Lac and Hatchet Lake in particular, are isolated points where we must travel by air in order to reach our communities. Black Lake is fortunate to have an all-season road, not the best, but at least they can come in and out on a regular basis without having to rely on air transportation. We have a total student population of approximately 1,300 students. Now, within our communities, Hatchet Lake First Nation has 2 schools. We have Father Margaret High School with approximately 260 students, and that's grades 6 to 12. We also have Father Margaret Elementary School, which is pre-K to grade 5 with 225 students. In Black Lake, we have Father Port Memorial Denesuline School, which is a pre-K to grade 12 with 460 students. And in Fond du Lac, we have Father Gamache Memorial School, which is a pre-K to grade 12 with approximately 385 students. So that comprises the location as well as the number of schools we have. In total of our staff and employees within ADEA, we have approximately 300 employees. When we look at the development of the authority, we began with the knowledge that we received from ISC that the Education Transformation Initiative from the federal government was being initiated in December of 2016. I was approached at the time, being a consultant, to assist the communities in determining whether an amalgamation or going to a public school division, provincial, or remaining independent. So I had developed an education authority in 2005 in this province, where I had began with 6 bands, developing an independent education authority under the New Paths funding at the time. When I was approached to assist the Dene communities, I was excited, and it gave me a perspective of certainly the needs of our schools and communities and looking at their education that they were currently receiving. And it was not good. With that, we began by submitting, of course, our proposal into structured readiness to get some funding in order to conduct consultation meetings within each community. So our first structural readiness proposal was submitted in January of 2017. From that time of submitting the proposal, we weren't informed of its acceptance until June of 17. And so from that point, what we had submitted in the proposal for funding certainly wasn't realized in what we received. It's typical, but again, we began to schedule some meetings, and the first item on my agenda certainly was to establish what I call the working committee to assist me and certainly start organizing community meetings. From that point, seeing as how we had isolated communities, it was necessary to fly from Prince Albert to each community where meetings were conducted with leadership, with the community members, particularly parents, with staff of the schools, and also the senior students. So I really wanted to get a perspective from all our stakeholders within our communities as to what they would want to see as improvements to their educational opportunities. The whole idea certainly of our authority was to improve the educational opportunities for the children, and first and foremost, to gain control of the education that the schools were providing at the time. There was a lot of discussion, certainly, in looking at the idea of amalgamating, which was not so much a new concept for the communities as they had done so in health and in ICFS systems. But for education, it was going to be very different. We're talking about their children in particular, the schools, what opportunities the children had as far as an education. So within these discussions, we certainly looked at the pros and cons of establishing an authority. Did they want to, rather than amalgamate, join a provincial system, which was an option? Or did they want to remain by themselves, independent, and carry on as they were doing? There was a lot of interesting conversations, challenges, but at the end of the day, we focused on what do you have now? Are you pleased? Are you satisfied with the education your children are receiving? And by far, the answer from our parents, from our students, was absolutely not. We're not happy, particularly the parents. So things had to change. What we looked at was, what are the possibilities of change? What would that look like? What would you want to see in terms of change? It was very evident at the onset that what our students were receiving in education was a bare minimum. In other words, a strictly academic program. And that in itself was limited. When you look at the senior sciences, for example, that wasn't available. Staffing was a problem. Recruitment of teachers was a problem. Our facilities also weren't in the condition they should have been. So it became apparent that no way did any of our communities want to be part of the provincial system. That was not an option for them. So then we discussed heavily, well, do you want to remain as you are now, or do you want your children to have better service, have better programs, have better opportunities in your schools? And by and far, that is what our parents and our communities and our elders all wanted to see happen. So then it became the challenge of, okay, what would an authority look like? How would we develop this authority? What structure do you think should be in place? So we were receiving a lot of this feedback from our community. So, and again, the location of our communities created many challenges in hosting or conducting meetings within each community. As their isolated points, certainly in the wintertime, getting to our communities by air is always dependent on weather. So the number of meetings we were able to have certainly wasn't what we had targeted to begin with. We started with a working committee of approximately 12 members, where we selected the director of education in each community. We wanted the principal of the school. We wanted a member of the leadership team in each community, that is the education portfolio counselor. We also wanted a parent member that would be a part of the working committee, so that we could sit and discuss the structure and what would be required to establish an authority. The funding through structured readiness was always a major challenge. When we first started, and I indicated we received approval in June from a January submission, we didn't receive any funding till December. So that created so many problems for us. And always when you apply for structured readiness funding, you put together all the work in a proposal to get X number of dollars based on all the activities you list. And then you receive notice that, oh no, you're not getting that amount of money, here's what you're getting. So that created many challenges for us in certainly trying to put together a structure. So prior to ADEA, as I mentioned, all our schools were operating independently under chief and council. One of the messages that was loud and clear from our community was, we do want to remove politics from education. And that was a very strong selling point in terms of, okay, if that's your wish, here's what your authority could look like. That it would be an independent authority, very accountable to the leadership and to the community. So when we looked at how are we going to organize ourselves, it started with certainly the community, the leadership, and then the authority in that order. We are totally accountable to the leadership. We are totally accountable to our communities. But we do have what I call an independent board of directors. So in establishing and working on how our structure would look like, it became very apparent that we need to keep politics out. However, we do need representation from each community. There also has to be a central location or a central office. And what would that look like? Well, what we envisioned certainly was, where would that central office be, first of all? If it's in one of the communities, here's the politics. The other two wouldn't be happy that it's in the other one. And it didn't matter which community you would pick. It would bring some political agenda to the table. We didn't want that. The other issue was there was no facility in each of the communities that would house a central office. Also, to attract very qualified personnel to serve our schools and our communities would not be very conducive to attracting them in the extreme far north. All the flights to our communities come out of Prince Albert. So it was very common to think, well, the central office then should be in Prince Albert in order to bring the board of directors together for meetings, for example. It meant more to fly down to Prince Albert, host the meetings there. Virtual meetings was not really available at the time. And also the flights are rather difficult. So you can fly from Prince Albert to Fond du Lac and to Black Lake, but you cannot fly directly from Fond du Lac, Black Lake, and to Hatchet Lake on the same flight. So in order to get to our communities, you would need to fly to Fond du Lac, then spend an evening, and then fly back to Prince Albert, spend another evening, and then fly to Hatchet Lake. So the flights do not go from Hatchet Lake to Black Lake to Fond du Lac. It just goes back and forth from your community to Prince Albert and Saskatoon. Excuse me. So it made economical, financial sense to host the central office in Prince Albert, and that's where we are. Now, when we looked at wanting to structure an authority with nothing, so when we began organizing the structure, we didn't even have a box of paper clips. We had zero. We didn't have an existing office on a reserve. We didn't have any facilities. We had nothing. And so the structured readiness certainly was a key component in the funding in order to be able to establish the authority. In our workings with ISC and with our bands and the leadership, it became very important that we have an agreement that would solidify the authority and would give the bands also the right to give the authority that full authority of providing educational services and everything that goes with it. So we began to organize a structure that would have a board of directors. Now, how was this going to look? It was critical that in order to keep politics away, that we have parent involvement and that we have parent representation on the board of directors. We have 3 communities, therefore it was recommended that we have 2 members from the community to sit on the board of directors. These are parents of the children going to school, and it means a lot to them to improve that educational opportunity for their children. The other aspect was, yes, we want to keep politics out. However, we do need the involvement of the leadership of each community. Therefore, the education portfolio counselor was appointed to the board ex officio. In other words, our 2 members from the community have voting privilege. The education portfolio counselors have full discussion, participation, but non-voting privilege on any motions or considerations. But yes, they certainly have a voice, and their role basically is to report back to the leadership from our monthly meetings on the activities of the authority as well as the meetings. And critical and important was to have an elder from each community that would sit with the board. The elders are very, very critical, important, honorable, respectful, and it is critical that we have the elders there. So there is an elder that is appointed from each community. We looked at the feasibility. Do we appoint? Do we have election of members to the board? There was no funding whatsoever to conduct any elections, and the leadership chose to appoint rather than run an election. Doing an election certainly creates more politics. And it was important that if leadership wanted to appoint, that the appointments be with education in mind and nothing else. And so we really emphasized that full point. And that was totally supported by the elders. And so our board of directors then consists of 12 members from the 3 communities, 4 from each. 2 voting parents, 1 ex officio education portfolio counselor, and 1 ex officio elder. Our meetings are held in Prince Albert so that we can gather together on a monthly basis. The development of the structure of ADEA and looking at our agreement with ISC and with the bands, we put together an organizational chart, what it would look like. You need services from a central point to serve the schools in the various capacities of education. We looked very seriously at developing our own Education Act. We developed our own Board of Education or Board of Directors policy manual. And we looked at each band's policy manual that they had in place for their schools or education within their communities. We pulled together the 3 policies and we brought together all the commonalities within each of those, as well as other procedures that should have been there and weren't there. So before we began any discussions and agreements and looking at our structure, we had in place our act that we shared with leadership, that we shared with community, we shared with staff of the schools and students. We had the Board of Directors policy manual. And my belief is the less policies you have, the better it is. So the policy manual refers largely to the Board of Directors, their role, responsibilities, and how to conduct themselves within the authority. The admin procedures are what guides the operations of our school, the authority as well. So when we looked at that, and it was decided that, yes, we have to begin negotiations with ISC on our agreement, and the go-ahead to get the authority all established. Negotiations with ISC on an agreement, we refused to even consider a regional education agreement. I wouldn't go there, and I advised our members not to go there as a regional education agreement. It's a unique agreement specifically for our communities who are in isolated points, and they're the most northern communities in Saskatchewan. If we put it in perspective, if you were to drive, for example, from Black Lake to Prince Albert, which is located in the center of the province, you're looking at a 14-hour drive. And so the uniqueness of our communities, of our schools, is not reflected anywhere else in the province. We put together an agreement that would create our authority as a completely independent board and authority. We are not at the whim of chief and council. We are at the whim of our parents and community. We certainly are accountable to the leadership of each community, but it is the board of directors that operates the authority and not the chief and councils. And I think that's a very important factor, because in my previous life, where I established another education authority in the province in 2005, we did have politicians on the board, and that was not good. So that was an accepted fact, that our board of directors would be independent and fully responsible for all second level, third level, whichever level of education services that would be provided. In our discussions with ISC, I want to refer to our agreement at this point, that we have, number one, our inherent right to education. We control it, we own it. It is our right to have this authority. It is our right to conduct our education opportunities for our schools, our children, our communities from ADEA. The second aspect of our agreement is our funding model. That was a very critical part of our agreement that is yet to be settled. As we are in a unique location and not part of a provincial system, we absolutely refute any idea of being put in the rest of the province in terms of looking at a funding model that is part of a provincial funding formula. We absolutely refuse to accept the funding formula. There was a direct challenge from our chiefs to tell ISC, no, you will not tell us what our funding is going to be. We are telling you what our funding is going to be. I was very proud of them for that, because that is another critical point of the success of our authority. We have our right to negotiate, and I hesitate using the word negotiate, because we have the right to discuss what our funding is going to be for our education authority and the needs of our children. And that is embedded within our agreement. Another important aspect of our agreement is what we call the delegation agreement. So what was critical so that it would solidify our authority, give it its independence, that there be a delegation agreement, which is each leadership from our communities signed over all responsibilities of pre-kindergarten to grade 12 education to the authority, which includes resources, which includes staffing, which includes transportation, finance, as I guess we could say a provincial school division would operate. So we have the total package on providing the services to our communities. And I say we've done an excellent job in establishing that.